I stumbled across this vintage t-shirt the other day and I thought it would be a fun and easy design to break down. I was wrong. Upon further inspection, it was absolute hell. Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. I'm Duran with DuranSupply.com, where I help you design smarter, not harder. We're going to check out how to reverse engineer this design in Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator. I'm also not going to be using any of my templates like depth tone or vent tone so that you can follow through with this video and still make a graphic just like this if you don't have those in your toolbox. However, I do recommend picking up vent tone or depth tone from my shop because they do make the vintage graphic making process a lot easier. I've got plenty of videos with those templates on my channel if you want to check those out. This is also going to be more of an advanced tutorial, so I'm going to assume you have a pretty decent knowledge of the programs that we're using like Photoshop and Illustrator. Let's get right into it. The first thing we want to do is open up Adobe Illustrator. The reason being is if we want to create this sort of tapered rainbow look that the reference in this t-shirt has, it's almost impossible to do that in Photoshop, and I nearly had an aneurysm trying to figure that out. So we're going to open up Illustrator here and create a new document that's 16 by 20 inches. So you already have that preset here, 16 by 20 inches. We're going to click on Create. Next up, we'll grab our ellipse tool and create a fairly big circle within this document. We're going to want to center that to the canvas using the Align controls up here. And then we want to knock out the fill of this circle. So I'll go and just knock out the fill. All we want on this is a black stroke. And we're going to set the stroke up to somewhere around 50 pixels. Next up, we're going to grab the width tool in the toolbar right here. And we're going to go ahead and click on the top edge of this circle and just drag that out to create a taper towards the top edge of this circle. You kind of have to eyeball this. I'm going to make it about yay thick. And then we also want to make a point right at the top left here, right before the perfect center split of the circle. So right around here, we'll click on the path and taper that in towards a spike really. So we're going to taper that in all the way, and now we have this perfect sort of spike taper coming in towards the this half of the circle. And then we just want to drag this point inwards a bit till we get to the perfect center of the circle. Then we can play with the thickness of the bottom half of the circle here just to get the right taper on this. So I'm going to click on that bottom point and drag that out as well, just a little bit so that the circle is a little bit thicker towards the bottom here. I also might want to bloat the taper of the right edge of the circle a bit, so I'm going to drag that out as well. I'm going to make this whole circle a bit smaller so that we have a little bit more room to work with here. And I'm going to take another look at the reference here so we make sure we have the taper of the circle pretty much aligned pretty nicely to the way they have it in this t-shirt. Now here's the part I really struggled on. So we got the basic shape here, right? But how do we split this up into those perfect sections to get the colors of the rainbow in here? I'm admittedly horrible at Illustrator, so there could totally be a better way of doing this, but here's how I went about it. So the first thing we're going to do is replace the fill of the stroke with a gradient. So we're going to want to open up the gradient dialog in Illustrator by going up to Window and then Gradients. So that's somewhere around here. I'll click on that, open up the gradient dialog right here. And now I want to select the fill and change that to a gradient by clicking on one of the types here. We're going to make this a linear gradient, so click on the linear gradient type. And then for how the gradient is applied to the stroke, we're going to want to go with the third option here, which applies the gradient across the stroke. And then we're just going to take the white value of this gradient and set that to an off-white. So I'm just going to bring the luminosity of this down a bit to around 5%. And now we have a 5% gray to black gradient on this stroke here. But now we still need those concrete bands within the shape. So here's what we'll do. We're going to select this and do Command C to copy. And then we're going to go back to Photoshop and we're going to paste that in our document. By the way, I'm using a document size the same size as Illustrator and the same size that I always use, which is a 16 by 20 inch document at 300 dpi. You can really use whatever document size you like. I like using 16 by 20 inches. Just make sure the resolution is on 300. So now that we're in our document here, we're just going to do Control V to paste that shape into Photoshop. And we're going to paste that as a smart object and click OK. Okay, cool. So now we have this shape pasted into Photoshop. And from here, we can make these sections on this shape to turn that into that cool rainbow that we have in our reference here. So we got to create a fun little setup within Photoshop here to get those rainbow bands on our shape. First thing we want to do is make a levels adjustment right above this shape layer. And we're just going to leave that blank for now because we're going to come back to this later. Then we're going to add a hue/saturation adjustment layer on top of that levels and drag the saturation of this all the way down. Finally, we're going to slap a posterize adjustment on top of all of these adjustments, and then we're going to set the levels of this posterize to 8, and that's going to get us 7 decently spaced out bands within the shape here. So it's posterizing that black to gray gradient into a lower bit depth, and now we're getting that pixel banding, which is going to let us select out each of these little bands and turn it into its own color. So this is maybe the only time that pixel banding is actually working for us versus against us. So a pretty cool little technique there. We have our 7 bands, which is perfect because that's the amount we want for the rainbow. But this technique can get a little finicky, so say you don't have exactly 7 bands, or maybe the spacing is a bit off. That's why we put the levels adjustment in here. And from here, if you go back to the levels adjustment and start playing with the midtone slider, you can change the width of these bands as well as how many bands there are. So just play with that level slider until you find a nice spot for the width of the bands and the amount of bands within the shape. So now you can see where we're going. We're going to select all of these layers and put that in a group. You can name this whatever. Then we're just going to do Command Alt or Option E on our keyboard to make a merge duplicate of this group, and then we can hide the original group here. And now we're going to select out each one of these little bands using our magic wand tool and put them all on their own separate layers. So we'll grab our magic wand tool by clicking W on our keyboard. We're going to make sure anti-alias and contiguous are unchecked, and now we can select each gray level on these little bands here to put them on their own layer. So we'll select the bottom one here, right click and do layer via cut. That's going to put it on its own layer, and then we just rinse and repeat that process for every band inside of the shape. So now we have all the bands on their own separate layers, and we can color these individually according to our rainbow gradients. So I'm just going to drag in a reference of the rainbow colors here so I can pick them out pretty easily, and then we're going to go one by one to color all of these bands according to the rainbow. So we're going to open up the layer styles of all of these bands layers and add a color overlay to them one by one using our reference of the colors here. So I'm going to put a color overlay on the first one here and just pick that purple color. I'm going to rinse and repeat this for every band in the rainbow gradient. So we get that light blue here, move on to the dark blue, add a color overlay and pick that dark blue out, yada yada yada. We're gonna do this for all of the colors within the rainbow. Cool, so now we got this rainbow shape fully colored, and now we're gonna set that to the side real quick. So I'm gonna select all of the layers here that we just worked with, and we're gonna put that in a group and just name that rainbow, and we're gonna hide that layer. And now next up, we wanna make a new gray layer with 50% gray. So we're gonna create a new layer and do Shift Backspace on our keyboard. We're gonna make sure the contents are 50% gray and press OK. It's gonna fill the space of this layer with a 50% gray. Now we wanna go into Filter, Filter Gallery, and we wanna use a grain filter on this. So that's all the way down in the texture group. Just click on grain, and for the grain type, I'm using regular, and here are the settings I have. It doesn't really matter. You can play with these as much as you want. I'm gonna put the intensity around 50 and the contrast around 50 as well. And then I'm also gonna add another grain here by clicking this new effect layer, and it's going to duplicate that grain. I'm going to set that grain type to enlarged, and I'm just going to keep the same settings on this one, and we're going to press OK. Now we want to desaturate this layer, so do Command U on your keyboard and bring the saturation all the way down. And we're also going to turn this into a smart object by right clicking and converting it to a smart object. And finally, we're going to add a little bit of blur to this with Filter, Blur, Gauge, and Blur. And I'm just going to choose anywhere from 1 to 5 pixels. The reason we made this a smart object is so that we can come back and change this later, because this is going to affect sort of the grain or Xerox Grain dither / filter that we're putting on top of this whole design. So if you want a more pronounced grainy effect on the final design, you can come back and change this later. Obviously, that's a later problem. So for right now, I'm just going to set this to around 2. I'm gonna press OK, and I also want to crank up the contrast just a little bit, so I'm gonna do Command L on my keyboard and just bring the black value in a little bit and the white value in a little bit as well. That's just gonna crank up the contrast on this grain layer. It's looking good to me. We're gonna press OK on that, and now we have our grain layer set. We're gonna go ahead and name that Xerox Grain. This is a technique that I outlined in a previous tutorial, so if you're familiar with this, you already know what to do. But anyway, next step we're gonna do is add a threshold adjustment on top of this grain layer. We're just gonna keep that as is, but we wanna set the blending mode of the grain layer to overlay. Now anything we do under these two layers is going to have that Xerox Grain effect applied to it, and it's going to be a really cool live effect. We're getting that really cool Xerox Grain look applied to everything we do under these layers. So now we want to composite our design. So just for the sake of staying organized, I'm going to put these two layers in a group, and I'm going to name that Xerox Grain effect, and then right under that I'm going to make another group, and I'm going to name this Composition. This is where we're going to composite our entire design. We also want to put a black layer inside of this composite group, so we're going to create a new solid color layer, make sure that's black, and just keep that at the bottom of that group. So here's what we'll do now. We're going to take this rainbow group that we made earlier and duplicate that with Command J on our keyboard and drag that into our composite. I'm going to unhide this layer, and I'm also going to add a color overlay on top of the group and make sure that color overlay is set to white. And we're also going to add a triangle into this design. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a triangle from our triangle tool and just drag that out into this design. We also want to center the top point or the center point of this triangle with the center point of this circle right here, or this shape. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that's centered and then drag it into the spot that I want it to be, which is up here. And in the reference design, the triangle is a little elongated, so I'm going to do the same thing on this design. I'm going to make sure it's a little bit elongated vertically, and I want to make sure the sizing is just right as well. So I'm going to go ahead, take a look at our reference design here, and just scale that triangle to a similar size. Right around here looks good to me. Next thing I'll do is go into the layer styles of this triangle and hit a color overlay. We want to make this black. And then we're going to add a inner shadow to this. We want to make that inner shadow white and then just crank up the size of that inner shadow. As you can see, we're already getting that really cool Xerox Grain effect on this. Let's bring the choke up as well to give some more body to this inner shadow. And then I'm just going to turn the opacity down a bit for this so that it's not too overpowering of an effect. I'm also going to make another inner shadow here. I'm going to bring the choke up quite a bit. Then I'm just going to bring the opacity down a little bit more. This is always something we can just come back to later if the effect is too strong. So I'm going to leave that as is for now. One thing I do want to do is get less of a harsh fade on gradients like this. For example, this inner shadow is pretty harsh. So if I want to sort of increase the intensity of the grain, I'm going to just open up our Xerox Grain effect layer here, go down to our actual Xerox Grain layer and just duplicate that layer. And that's going to get us a softer sort of fade on gradients like this. And that looks really nice for the inner shadow we have here. Cool. So we got the basic shaping of this blocked out. But one thing we want to add is in this reference here, there's a little triangle sort of peeking out of the spike of the big circle shape that we made earlier. So I'm just going to sort of makeshift recreate that. I did sort of make the taper a little too tiny here, so I'm going to go ahead and fix that off camera, but unless you're designing with me, just keep note of that to don't make the taper too small here, because we still have to add that little triangle peeking out into the big triangle here. And also just this side of the circle is a little too tiny, so I'm just going to fix that real quick. Okay, so I fixed the taper bit. Now we're going to go ahead and create this little detail of this little triangle within the big triangle that's sort of connecting to the shape that we have going on here. So what I'll do is select this big rainbow shape layer, and I'm going to make a merge duplicate of that by doing Command Alt E on my keyboard. I'm going to drag that above the triangle, that big triangle that we created here. And I'm going to zoom in here so we can go fine on the details. I just want to create a triangle shape sort of peeking out of this little sliver of our big circle shape here. First of all, I'm just going to mask out the little part of our shape that intersects with the triangle. So using my polygonal lasso tool, I'm just going to make a rough selection of this part of our shape. I'm going to create a mask on this rainbow layer that we're working on here. Click and create a layer mask. And now I'm just going to drag out a triangle on top of here using our triangle tool. And I'm going to align that with the sort of shooting star shape that we have going on here. All right, that's looking good to me. Next up, we're going to add a similar inner shadow on this small triangle here. So all I'll do is copy over the layer styles from this big triangle by holding down Alt and dragging on the effects icon onto our new triangle here. And then I'm also just going to make these layer styles a bit smaller by right clicking on the effects icon here, going down to scale effects and turning this somewhere low like 40 or 50 or something like that. Now we have that similar inner shadow going on this small triangle here. And we're getting pretty close to our reference, I'd say. Now it's time to add the actual band members into the composite of this design. So the band members are spread out into these different circles that they're clipped to within the shape that we did. And they've also got this sort of wisping or extrusion leading them to a point in the center of the design, which is really cool. And we need to incorporate some 3D into our workflow here to do that. And I tried doing that using Illustrator, but the effect really wasn't nice at all, and it didn't get us the kind of extrusion that we wanted. And I'm not going to touch Photoshop 3D at all because that is one mess of a filter. So we're going to do this using a plugin called Eye Candy. Actually, funny enough, I displayed that same plugin in another tutorial where I was making 3D text, and that 3D text also happened to say Pink Floyd. So it's pretty funny that we get to use that plugin for 2 Pink Floyd designs now. But in any case, you could download this plugin online. Just search up Eye Candy 7 for Photoshop, and it's going to be this link from Exposure Software. You'll also notice that there is a free trial for this plugin. So just by entering your email in here, you can get a free 30-day trial of Eye Candy 7. And no, I'm not sponsored by these guys or anything. This is just an amazing plugin that gets us that really cool extruded effect that we can use for this design and many others like the tutorial I was just talking about that I made 3D text in. So you can go ahead and download the free 30-day trial of Eye Candy. And if you like it, obviously you can pay for it, or you could just use the free trial. Personally, I paid for this plugin because I use it all the time, and I think it's amazing, and I would love to support the creators of this plugin. It's just a one-time payment, no subscription bullshit, so I really can't recommend it enough. But anyway, let's get back to our design here. So we want to add the photos of the band members here, as well as the extrusion of those circles to a center point of the design. So the first thing we're going to do is start placing out these circles around or inside our shape. So I'm going to take the circle tool here and just start drawing out these circles roughly in the spots that the reference design has it in. So we got a pretty big one out here to the left, then we have a slightly smaller one right down to the bottom right of that. Then we've got a fairly big one out here to the right side of this graphic. And then we've got sort of a tiny one around up here at the bottom right end of the triangle. It's looking pretty accurate to me. I think we could start on the 3D effect now. So I'm going to put all of these circles in a group, and I'm going to name this band members. And then I'm going to make a merge duplicate of this group using Command Alt or Option E on our keyboard. And then we're going to run the extrusion effect from Eye Candy on this layer. So once you've installed that, you go up to Filter, Exposure Software, and then Eye Candy 7. That's going to open up the Eye Candy panel here. And from the effect options, you want to just choose Extrude. So that's what I've selected here. For the settings, the extrude distance doesn't really matter too much. You can play with that and find a spot that works. The one slider or the two sliders that matter the most is taper and smoothness. So make sure the taper is all the way on 100 and smoothness is all the way also on 100. And then you can just drag out this little point here to change the direction or the distance of the extrusion. I'm going to leave that right around here. I also want to make sure that I have the color set to solid color. And for the color, I'm just choosing a gray here. It doesn't really matter. Just make it something that's not white or black. That way we can get more detail from the light. And then for the light direction, you can play around with this until you find a nice spot for the light that gives you as much detail as you want. I'm going to choose something around here and I'll press OK on this, and that's going to render that extrusion onto our Photoshop document. Okay, so we've got that extrusion rendered onto our graphic now, and now we can start adding in all the band members. The first thing I'm going to do actually to get this closer to the reference is invert this with Command I. That's just going to change the lighting on the extrusion a bit. I can also delete the layer that we used to make this with, this one right down here, and I'm also going to bring the extrusion behind the group of the band members. Now we're going to open up the band members group and start clipping in photos to each one of these circles. So I actually found the exact photos that are used in the reference t-shirt right here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that into my document right here. Now I'm going to duplicate this layer 4 times and start clipping these photos into these circles. So I'm going to take the first duplicate here, drag that down to the first ellipse we made, and hold down Alt and click between the layers to create a clipping mask within the circle. And I'll drag the photo to where I want it. I'm going to do the same process for each one of these circles here. So I'm going to drag the other duplicate of this photo, clip that to the second ellipse, and then drag that till I get the photo just where I want it. Again, rinse and repeat. I'm going to make the photo a clipping mask onto the third circle here. Cool, so now we got all the band members in this design. Now we can move on to adding the text, the textures, and the colors for this design. I'm going to start with the text first. So there's just a Pink Floyd within the big triangle here, and then a Dark Side of the Moon tour kind of wrapping around the circle shape at the bottom here. So I'll start with the Pink Floyd. I'm going to grab my type tool and just type out Pink Floyd. I believe the font they use is just Helvetica, so I'm going to switch this to Helvetica. It looks like Helvetica Bold to me, so I'll use either that or Helvetica Black. I'm just going to go with Bold here, and I'm just going to scale this up to size till we get close to the reference. Looking good to me. Now let's make this type sort of wrapping around the circle here. So here's how we're going to make that. We're going to take our circle or ellipse tool and make sure we change the mode here from shape to path. And then we're going to drag a ruler from our rulers, which is just Command R on our keyboard, to the leftmost point of the circle and the bottommost point on the circle. Then we're going to go to the intersection of those two lines, hold down Shift and drag out a circle till we sort of match the curve on the bottom left part of the circle here. Then I'm just going to use Command T to make this circle a little bit bigger. Somewhere around here is going to work just fine. I'm going to drag that to the right just a little bit. And then we're going to take our type tool, that's T on our keyboard, and click on this path. That's going to make sure our text is actually aligned to the path of the circle. I'm just going to type out Dark Side of the Moon tour. Then we're going to go back to our direct selection tool and hover over the text here. And now we can drag and move this wherever we want. I'm going to move it right about here. The original reference had it directly under the circle right about here, but I kind of like how this composition looks when the text is offset to the left a little bit. Kind of balances out the big side of the circle that we have on the top right of the graphic. Then I'm just going to change the font to Helvetica Regular, and there we go. Now we have our text looking good. It's time to move on to texturing and coloring. So we're going to be using my Warm Plastisol textures from my Warm Plastisol kit that's available on my website, and we're also going to be using some textures from my Inkwell texture kit, which is also available on my website. So we've got both of those open here. I'm going to drag in my Warm Plastisol 3 texture, and I'll make sure that's on top of everything, but it's also still under the big Xerox Grain effect layer that we have up here. And just for clarity, I'm going to make this layer red so we know not to put anything on top of that layer for now. We want to make sure everything is still encased in that Xerox Grain effect. So we have this texture on here. I'm going to set that to multiply to isolate the black parts of it and get that texture all over our design. And that just looks so sexy already because my Warm Plastisol textures are absolutely beautiful. These are actually real, authentic, scanned in, cracked Plastisol ink. So it just looks beautiful, and when you add it to your design, it adds a whole new dimension of texture and depth. We're also going to add a texture from my Inkwell texture kit, so I have that open here as well. I'm going to drag in Inkwell 01 on top of this composition. We're going to set the blend mode of that to darken or multiply, but darken gets a little bit less of an effect, so I'm going with darken here. I'm also just going to blur this texture a little bit to get a little bit less detail and more heavy specks of grunge around the design. So I'm just going to blur it by about 1 pixel here. And remember, like I said, we can always go back in and change the size or the blurriness of the Xerox Grain on this design. So pretty much the only thing left to do with this is color it. So we're gonna get into that right now. Okay, so pretty much the only coloring in this design is the rainbow and a little bit of yellow/orange on the text here. So we can do that all pretty easily. What we're gonna do is bring back that rainbow group layer that we made all the way at the beginning, where we colored each individual strip of the rainbow. So we're gonna bring that all the way on top of our document, and we're gonna put that on top of the Xerox Grain effect group layer that we have here. And we're also gonna put this in a group, so Command G to put that in a group. I'm gonna unhide this real quick, and I'm gonna name this group color, and I'm gonna set the blending mode of this group to multiply. And that's gonna apply the color of the rainbow onto the white parts of this design, just where we want it. However, we can see that the color of the rainbow is bleeding in a little bit to the triangle here. So what we'll do to fix that really quickly is go ahead and grab a selection of the triangle by holding down Command and clicking on that layer thumbnail, then going all the way back up here and creating a layer mask on that rainbow layer by clicking right down here. And that's going to create a layer mask that we just have to invert with Command I, and now we have that rainbow not creeping into the triangle here. You'll also notice on the reference design that the rainbow sort of fades into white around here, so we can recreate that pretty quickly. All we're going to do is go into the layer mask on this rainbow group layer, take a soft brush, make sure your primary color is black, and just start painting out this spot of the design where we want the rainbow to fade to white. We do, however, want a grainy fade on this, and right now it is not a grainy fade. We have a bunch of transparency going on, obviously because we used a soft brush. So here's how we could fix that. We're going to make sure we have the layer mask of the rainbow group selected, then go up to filter gallery, and we still have these two grains in here that we use to create the actual Xerox grain effect. Now we're going to be adding one more effect on top of this, which is the torn edges effect. So go ahead and create a new effect layer down here and change that to torn edges, which is in Sketch. You want to make sure the smoothness is bumped up all the way and the contrast is somewhere in the middle, and that'll get you somewhere around here. And you can see we've turned that soft brush fade into more of a grainy fade. So I'm going to press OK on here, and once we zoom into the actual part of that rainbow here, we can see we now have a grainy fade on that soft brush. So that's pretty cool to have, you know, all the colors of the rainbow consolidate into that white color. Now we want to do the coloring of the text, so all we'll do is create a new solid color layer, and we want to pick a color from the rainbow. So I'm actually going to just press OK on that and hide that colorful layer, and I'm going to use my color picker to pick out the yellow color that we used on the rainbow. Then I'll unhide this colorful layer and just fill it with that yellow color that we just picked from the rainbow. And we're going to set the blending mode of this layer to multiply as well, and then we're going to take a brush. We want this to be a hard brush, so go ahead and turn the hardness of this brush all the way up, and then I'm just going to go into the layer mask here and invert it with Command I, and now I can use my brush with my primary color as white to paint on where I want this color. So that would be on the Pink Floyd text right here and on the dark side of the moon text right down here. Now one final addition of color to bring this all together, I want to make a new colorful layer, so go ahead and make a new solid color layer, and we just want to make this sort of a creamy off-white. So I'm going to go into the orange hue here and just choose a little bit of an off-white, maybe somewhere around here. So sort of a cream color. We'll press OK on that, and then just set this blending mode to either darken or multiply, whatever you think sort of fits best with the colors here. I'm going to go with multiply, maybe turn the opacity down to 70 or something, and that's going to sort of tone down all the colors within the graphic and give it sort of a warm hue. And now we're pretty much done. I think we're pretty close to the reference now. It's looking really, really good. Obviously, I'm not going to send this off to print, but say you were making a design like this for your brand or for a client and you want to send this off to print, here's how I would prepare this for print. So I'm going to close this color group here, and I'm also going to close this composite group here, and I'm going to select all these layers and put them in their own group, and I'm going to name this group design, and then I'm going to right click on this design group and do convert to smart object. And now we have that whole design in a smart object, and we can open up the layer styles of that smart object, go into the blend if panel here, and just drag the black end of this current layer slider in just 1 or 2 levels. We'll click OK on that, and now if I hide this black background here, you can now see that we fully separated this design out from the background, and that's going to help us prep this file for print, or you could throw this on a t-shirt mockup of your choice. I'm going to go ahead and throw this on a Duran mockup real quick. This is my Comfort Colors tee mockup. I'll scale that down to size, and boom, look at that. Pretty damn cool. I'd say we got pretty close to the reference here, and I just love this design. It's really, really creative, so shout out to the original designer who created this. Obviously, that's a vintage t-shirt that we just referenced, so it was probably a while ago, but still, shout out to them. I wish I knew how they went about it, but either way, this was really, really cool to break down, especially since what I thought was going to be sort of a simple breakdown turned into not so much of a simple breakdown when we had to figure out this sort of tapered circle look and all the rest of the effects in this. But most importantly, I thought this would be a really cool learning experience for anyone watching this video. So yeah, I hope you learned something. And that's a wrap. This is one of my first full-length breakdown videos like this, so definitely let me know if you want to see more of these. I love reverse engineering designs, especially ones like this where it requires a little bit of intuitive thinking. So I really hope you learned something watching this. And if you like this video, like the video. If you like me, subscribe to the channel. I post videos like this every week to help you become a better designer. So I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace out.